Orville Thatcher had worked the same plot of land in western Nebraska for 43 years, inheriting the property from his father who had worked it for 30 years before him. The Thatcher farm had withstood dust storms, droughts, floods, and blizzards. But nothing had prepared Orville for what was coming that sultry June evening. The day had begun like any other summer day on the farm. Orville had risen before dawn, drunk his black coffee on the porch while watching the eastern sky lighten, then set about his chores. By midday, however, the air had grown unnaturally still. The usual chirping of birds had ceased, and even the yaw insects seemed to have gone quiet. A strange yellowish tinge colored the western sky. Orville's joints ached more than usual, and he felt a pressure in his sinuses that signaled a significant change in barometric pressure. "Something wicked this way comes," Orville muttered to himself, recalling his late wife Meredith's favorite line from Shakespeare. She had been gone 5 years now, but he still found himself speaking to her throughout the day. His prized Belgian draft horse, Thunderbolt, seemed to sense it too. The massive chestnut stallion paced nervously in his paddock, ears flicking back and forth, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Thunderbolt had been with Orville for 12 years, and was more than just a working animal. He was a companion, particularly since Meredith's passing. By late afternoon, the National Weather Service had issued tornado warnings for the county. Orville's ancient radio crackled with emergency alerts as he secured loose items around the yard. The sky had darkened to an ominous greenish-black in the west, and the air felt charged with electricity. "Come on, old friend," Orville said as he led Thunderbolt from the paddock toward the sturdy old barn. The horse balked, sensing danger. I know, but the barn's the safest place for you." The first fat raindrops began to fall as Orville secured Thunderbolt in his stall. The wind picked up rapidly, bending the tops of the cornstalks in the western field almost to the ground. Orville had intended to make it back to the house and its storm cellar, but as he peered out the barn door, he realized it was already too late. The sky had turned a shade of green he'd never seen before, and a roar like a freight train was building in the distance. "Looks like we're weathering this one together," he told Thunderbolt, patting the horse's muscular neck. Orville had just enough time to gather some supplies: rope, a blanket, his emergency flashlight, and the first aid kit he kept in the barn, before the full fury of the storm hit. The old barn, built by his grandfather with hand-hewn oak beams, groaned and shuddered as the wind hammered against it. Thunderbolt whinnied in terror as the sound grew deafening. The barn door rattled violently, then tore from its hinges entirely, flying into the darkness. Rain and hail poured in horizontally, and Orville could see, silhouetted against the stormy sky, the unmistakable funnel shape of a tornado bearing down directly on the farm. The tornado hit with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Orville had the presence of mind to secure himself in Thunderbolt's stall, looping rope around both himself and a sturdy beam, while keeping one hand on the horse's halter. The massive animal trembled beneath his touch, eyes rolling white with terror. "Easy now, easy," Orville shouted, though his words were swallowed by the deafening roar. He pressed his weathered face against Thunderbolt's neck, both for comfort and to shield himself from the debris now swirling through the barn. The walls creaked and portions of the roof began to peel away. Straw, tools, and smaller items lifted into the air, caught in the tornado's powerful vacuum. Orville watched in horror as his grandfather's old workbench, which must have weighed 300 pounds, slid across the floor as if it were made of paper before being sucked out through what remained of the doorway. Thunderbolt reared suddenly, nearly breaking free of Orville's grip. The farmer, despite his 70 years and arthritic joints, managed to maintain his hold while dodging the horse's powerful hooves. "We're staying put," Orville bellowed, his voice barely audible even to himself. "Together!" Something in his tone must have reached the panicked animal, for Thunderbolt settled somewhat, though his entire body continued to quiver. Rain and hail pelted them both as more of the roof tore away, exposing them to the swirling blackness above. Through gaps in the barn structure, Orville caught glimpses of his farmhouse 100 yards away. His heart sank as he watched portions of the roof rip off, followed by the entire front porch lifting whole into the air before disintegrating. The storm cellar where he should have been sheltering was now exposed to the elements. Time seemed to stretch and distort. Orville couldn't have said if 5 minutes or 45 had passed when suddenly, incredibly, a stillness descended. The roaring quieted, the wind calmed, and the rain slackened to a drizzle. Orville recognized what was happening. They were in the eye of the tornado. The temporary calm allowed him to assess their situation. Half the barn was simply gone, yet miraculously, the portion containing Thunderbolt's stall remained standing. The horse had several cuts from flying debris, and Orville himself had a gash on his forehead that was bleeding profusely, clouding his vision with red. Working quickly, he used the first aid kit to clean and bandage his own wound, then attended to Thunderbolt's injuries. Most were superficial, though one cut on the horse's flank would likely need stitches if they survived. "We're not out of this yet," Orville told the horse, glancing at the bizarre sight of clear, starry sky directly above them, surrounded on all sides by a circular wall of black cloud. "The backside's coming, and it could be worse than the front." His prediction proved all too accurate. Within minutes the roaring began again, this time from the opposite direction. Orville barely had time to secure himself in Thunderbolt before the second half of the tornado engulfed what remained of the barn. Dawn broke over a landscape so transformed that Orville hardly recognized it as his own farm. The tornado had finally passed around midnight, but he and Thunderbolt had remained in what was left of the barn until first light, both too exhausted and traumatized to move in the darkness. As sunlight gradually illuminated the devastation, Orville led Thunderbolt carefully through the wreckage. Half of the once proud barn was now just splinters and debris scattered across fields. His farmhouse stood, but barely. The entire second floor was gone, along with most of the east-facing wall. The machine shed had vanished entirely, along with the tractor and combine it had housed. Fields of nearly mature corn now resembled a giant's playground, with stalks flattened in circular patterns where the winds had touched down. "Could have been worse," Orville said grimly, stroking Thunderbolt's neck. "We're alive, that's what matters." The horse nickered softly, pressing his massive head against Orville's chest in an unusual display of affection. Both man and animal were covered in cuts, bruises, and mud, but nothing appeared to be broken or life-threatening. Orville's first priority was finding water. The power was obviously out, which meant the electric pump for the well wouldn't work. Thankfully, his father had insisted on keeping the old hand pump operational just in case, and that foresight now proved invaluable. Orville worked the handle until clear, cold water gushed forth, allowing both himself and Thunderbolt to drink deeply. His next concern was shelter. Though part of the house still stood, Orville didn't trust its structural integrity. The remains of the barn seemed more stable, with several support beams and a portion of the roof still intact. He led Thunderbolt back there and secured him to one of the remaining posts while he salvaged what he could. By midday, Orville had fashioned a makeshift shelter using tarps and lumber from the wreckage. He'd managed to find his emergency radio in the ruins of the kitchen and was relieved to hear that emergency services were being mobilized throughout the county. The nearest neighbor, Hector Villanueva, lived 3 miles down the road. Under normal circumstances, Orville might have walked the distance, but the roads were likely impassable with downed trees and power lines. Instead, he decided to wait it out, confident that help would eventually come. As he sat beside Thunderbolt beneath their jury-rigged shelter, sharing an apple he'd found intact amid the kitchen debris, Orville pondered the future. At 70, starting over seemed almost impossible. Insurance would cover some of the damage, but not all. And even with money, the physical labor required would be beyond him. "Might be time to hang up my hat," he told Thunderbolt quietly. The horse merely munched his portion of apple, seemingly content now that the immediate danger had passed. The sound of an approaching vehicle roused Orville from his thoughts. A mud-splattered pickup truck was carefully navigating the debris-strewn driveway, Hector Villanueva at the wheel. "Dios mío, Orville," Hector exclaimed as he climbed from his truck, surveying the devastation. "When we saw the tornado heading this way, we feared the worst." Orville rose stiffly to greet his neighbor, suddenly aware of every ache in his battered body. "We're still kicking, but it was a close call." Hector's family had worked the neighboring farm for nearly 2 decades, and though they hadn't always seen eye to eye on farming methods, Hector favored organic approaches while Orville stuck to Traditional techniques, a mutual respect had developed over the years. My sons are helping clear the roads. Emergency services should get through by evening, Hector explained, handing Orville a thermos of hot coffee and a bag containing homemade tamales. Malena sent these. She's organizing the church ladies to collect supplies. The simple kindness nearly broke Orville's composure. He nodded gruffly, accepting the offerings with murmured thanks. Over the next several hours, more neighbors arrived. The Patels from the dairy farm 5 miles east brought a generator and fuel. The Kowalskis brought tools and work gloves. By late afternoon, a small army of volunteers was clearing debris, salvaging possessions, and erecting a more substantial temporary shelter. Dr. Abernathy, the local veterinarian, arrived to treat Thunderbolt's wounds, stitching the deeper gash while praising Orville's initial first aid efforts. "This big fellow's lucky to have you," she said, patting the horse's flank gently. "Most people would have thought only of themselves in that situation. Thunderbolt's not most horses," Orville replied simply. As predicted, official emergency services reached the farm by early evening. Paramedics insisted on examining Orville despite his protests, cleaning and properly dressing his head wound, and administering tetanus shots to both him and several volunteers who had suffered cuts while clearing debris. County officials took inventory of the damage, assuring Orville that disaster relief funds would be available. The Red Cross set up a proper tent with cots, blankets, and a hot meal station. Watching his community rally around him, Orville felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The road ahead would be difficult, but he wouldn't be walking it alone. That night, despite offers of beds in neighbors' homes, Orville chose to sleep in the tent erected beside the remains of his barn. Thunderbolt had been moved to a makeshift corral nearby, with a tarp shelter protecting him from the elements. Man and beast had weathered the storm together, and somehow it felt wrong to separate now. As he drifted toward sleep on his narrow cot, Orville thought he heard Meredith's voice. "Community is what turns a house into a home, and a plot of land into something worth fighting for." "You were right, as usual," he whispered into the darkness, smiling despite everything. 3 months after the tornado, the Thatcher farm bore little resemblance to either its pre-storm state or the devastation that had followed. Where chaos and destruction had reigned, order and new construction now stood. Every weekend since the disaster, neighbors and community members had gathered for work parties. The events took on an almost festive atmosphere, with tables of food, children playing, and the satisfying rhythm of hammers and saws marking progress. Orville had initially balked at accepting so much help, his independent nature rebelling against what felt like charity. But Hector Villanueva had set him straight. "This isn't charity, viejo," Hector had said firmly. "This is community. Next time, maybe it's my farm or the Patels. That's how it works out here." The new barn rose first, larger and more modern than its predecessor, designed by Hector's son Miguel, who had studied architecture before returning to help run the family farm. It incorporated both traditional elements that Orville insisted upon and modern efficiencies that would make work easier. Thunderbolt watched the construction with curious eyes from his temporary paddock. The horse had recovered completely from his injuries, though a scar on his flank remained as a permanent reminder of that terrifying night. The farmhouse was rebuilt next, with the insurance money covering most costs. Orville had opted for a smaller, single-story design, more suitable for a man his age living alone. The extra insurance funds went toward equipment to replace what had been lost. Most surprising to Orville was the decision by the Villanueva family to formally merge operations with the Thatcher farm. It wasn't a buyout, Hector was insistent on that point, but a partnership that would eventually pass to his children. "My kids want to farm, but land is too expensive to buy," Hector explained. "Your body is telling you to slow down. It makes sense for all of us." After much consideration, Orville agreed. The arrangement allowed him to remain active in farm operations while gradually reducing his physical workload. Miguel and his siblings brought new ideas and energy, while Orville contributed decades of experience and intimate knowledge of the land. On a crisp October evening, exactly 4 months after the tornado, the community gathered again, not for work, but for celebration. Tables were set up in front of the new barn, laden with food contributed by dozens of families. String lights hung from posts, and someone had set up speakers playing a mix of country music and Mexican ballads. As dusk fell, Orville found himself standing slightly apart from the festivities, Thunderbolt beside him on a lead rope. Man and horse watched as children played tag between hay bales, teenagers awkwardly attempted to dance, and adults caught up on local gossip. "Quite a change from that night, old friend," Orville said quietly, stroking the horse's neck. Thunderbolt nickered softly, seeming to understand. Hector approached, carrying 2 glasses of amber liquid. "A toast," he said, handing one to Orville. "To survival and new beginnings." Orville raised his glass. "And to community," he added. As they drank, Orville gazed at his transformed property. Half the farm had indeed been destroyed that stormy night, but what had risen in its place was something unexpected and, in many ways, more valuable. The land that had sustained generations of Thatchers would continue to be worked, though in ways his father and grandfather might not have imagined. The tornado had taken much, but had given something too, a reminder that no man is truly self-sufficient, and that sometimes destruction clears the path for necessary change. Watching Thunderbolt interact gently with Hector's youngest grandchildren, Orville felt a sense of peace settle over him. The storm's fury had passed, and in its wake, life continued, resilient and ever adapting.